It is a real honor for me to host this meeting. The United States and China. There is probably no more important relationship between two nations than this one. Tonight, we will learn more about the issues and opportunities between the United States and China from former Secretary of State Madeline Albright via live webcast. We will also have the opportunity to discuss the issue and ask and answer your questions with an outstanding China expert, Robert Daly, who is with us tonight from Washington, D.C. And Robert, welcome. And I will introduce him in more detail after Secretary's presentation. Thanks for coming. There are only 60 sites across the United States that have been chosen by the National Committee on United States-China Relations to host this China Town Hall. And China Town Hall will happen simultaneously across the country at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We also noted that China Hall will also take place in Beijing at the American Chamber of Commerce and also in Hong Kong at Chinese University of Hong Kong. The National Committee on United States, as you probably already know, of United States and China relations was founded in 1966, very early, before ping-pong diplomacy, which they had a role in. The American organization has remained at the forefront of encouraging and fostering constructive dialogue, face-to-face interaction, open and frank interchange of ideas, and educating Americans and Chinese about the realities of each other's countries. Let me go quickly through some housekeeping before we launch. We will be able, as a group here, to text in 5 questions, or 6. We have 5 or 6 note cards here. It's a little bit challenging because not all of us know what Secretary Albright's going to say, but I think many of you can guess the macro topic she's going to talk about. Is there anyone who would like to write in a question that you know already what the question is? If you do, you can take a card and a pencil. If you're not sure, give it to Dixie, and you have a question in mind, give it to her, because what we want to do is, as soon as you have a question, write it down. One of our colleagues in the back will text or email it in, and this takes some coordination. So you have 60 sites, 5 questions, 300 questions, probably 85% overlap. But, if you have a question, seriously, feel free to write it down and submit it. I'm going to be back here to introduce Robert Daly after the broadcast, and we hope you will enjoy this special meeting. I think I spoke too fast because we still have 7 minutes and 30 seconds. But you know what I'm going to do? I think I'm going to introduce Robert Daly now. That will give us more time to hit him with questions. I'm very honored and very excited to introduce Robert to you. Robert is the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Kissinger Institute is dedicated to promoting greater understanding of issues in the United States and China relationship and its impact on both countries and the world. It employs a multidisciplinary approach that includes political, economic, historical, and cultural dialogue and education. Prior to his appointment to the Kissinger Institute, Robert was the head of the Maryland-China Initiative at the University of Maryland. The Maryland-China Initiative is the only university-based comprehensive training institute exclusively for Chinese civil servants in the United States. Previously, Robert was also the American director of the Johns Hopkins Nanjing Center in Nanjing, China, the preeminent university graduate center for education for American and Chinese conducted in Chinese. He also served in the U.S. Foreign Service in China and has taught Chinese at Cornell University. Importantly, I've checked him out before he came. He's noted among American China experts for having the best Chinese skills of all the China experts. And for those of us who try to speak Chinese, this is no mean feat. Last but not least it is important to note that Robert, also known as Daibo in Chinese, he was the American actor and star of the very famous 1992 Chinese TV soap opera, a native of Beijing and New York City. This soap opera still holds the record as being the most watched TV series in China. Talk about a lot of viewers. And I've actually now watched this afternoon 2 more episodes. So I've got 18 more to go, and it's a thriller. Robert has also helped produce Chinese language versions of Sesame Street and other children's television workshop programs. So it's my great pleasure and our great pleasure to have him here. So what we're going to do is, following Secretary Albright's presentation, he's going to give us some of his perspectives and comments and reactions, about 10 minutes, and then we're going to throw it open to a lot of questions and dialogue. Nothing is sacred here, and I think it'll be very, very educational and enjoyable. We'll stop promptly at 8:30 to let you go home, okay? Still have 4 minutes and 28 seconds. Any pre-Robert Daly questions or pre-Secretary Albright questions? Then why don't we just wait and we'll let it take off, okay? Thank you.
3, 2. Good evening from our nation's capital to those in the eastern and central states. Good afternoon to those in the mountain states on the West Coast and in Hawaii. I am Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I am pleased to welcome audiences from 66 venues throughout the country to our 7th annual China Town Hall Local Connections National Reflections. We created China Town Hall in the belief that U.S.-China relations are the defining relationship of the 21st century, and that getting that relationship right is the key to peace and stability throughout the world. Pick up any newspaper or magazine, watch or listen to any television or radio news program, and there is a story about China or about the U.S.-China relationship. China's economic and strategic decisions now affect every corner of the United States and the world. We are fortunate to have with us tonight an extraordinary American, Madeline Albright, who under President Clinton was our first female permanent representative of the United Nations, and then our first female Secretary of State. She now chairs the Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm, the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, and too many other firms to name. Her accomplishments are also too long to list, so let me only mention that last year, President Obama chose Secretary Albright to receive the nation's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, in recognition of her contributions to international peace and democracy. Before beginning, I would like to thank our partners at all 66 venues and our small but very dedicated National Committee staff, which has done a magnificent job in coordinating this complex nationwide event. Let me also thank our speakers, none of whom is paid. A veritable who's who of China experts in America. They have traveled throughout the country to talk with you because they believe, as we do, that educating Americans about China will help fashion policies that are in the long-term interest of the United States. In addition, we thank the Star Foundation for funding this exciting program. Last, but certainly not least, I thank Secretary Albright for joining us today. I've had the privilege of watching Secretary Albright give talks like this throughout her career, and I know we are in for a treat today. We are now accepting questions submitted electronically from our venues. We will get to as many as we can and apologize in advance to those who whose questions we don't have time to answer. Let me now turn the floor over to Secretary Albright.
Steve, thank you very, very much. And to our friends across the country, good evening to you all. I would like to thank you officially, Steve Orleans, for that very, very warm introduction, and the National Committee on United States-China Relations for inviting me to share this evening with you. I want to congratulate the National Committee for doing such a fine job in bringing together people to learn more about what I consider to be the most important bilateral relationship of this century. In many ways, the National Committee, founded 6 years before President Nixon's historic trip to Beijing, was very much, to quote, present at the creation. You've done so much to deepen our bilateral relationship with China over the last 4 decades. As we look to the future, the key question is whether the United States and China can work together to solve the world's important challenges despite different economic systems and divergent views on such matters as democracy, religious freedom, civil liberties, and the rule of law. In my view, this is certainly possible, so long as we recognize our disagreements and core differences with maturity, confront our challenges directly, and have leaders on both sides that are committed to this relationship. So tonight, I'd like to share my thoughts on how current American and Chinese leaders see the relationship and what is required of us in order to build a new model of bilateral relations, which both Presidents Obama and Xi have referenced as a possible unifying goal. My own perspective on this subject extends back several decades to the mid-1970s when I first began working in Washington. President Carter was in the White House, where I served on his national security staff. My job was to maintain good relations with Congress, an assignment that has often been compared then and now to herding cats. In that role, I accompanied a Senate delegation to China along with my mentor, the late Senator Edmund Muskie. Our goal was to persuade Congress that the time for normalized relations had come. Our countries did not know much about each other then, and we had to rely on magazines and history books for information. Some were great, but others circulated information that was inaccurate, distorted, or just plain wrong. And yet, by and large, American leaders kept an open mind and imagined that such a new relationship, what it would look like. The same was true for the Chinese, so we charted a new path and established formal ties in 1979. Now, almost 35 years later, that moment of connection continues to shape both our countries and the world. In my years of experience, I've learned that good relations between leaders matter a great deal. At the United Nations, I worked closely with my Chinese counterpart, Li Xiaojing, and he went on to serve as Chinese ambassador here in Washington at the same time that as I served as Secretary of State. The trust that we developed was crucial in our pursuit of bilateral cooperation. Of course, good relationships alone are not always enough. My working history with Li Xiaojing did not make it any easier for us to deal with the United States' accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the war in Kosovo. But it did serve as a valuable bedrock for enhancing engagement between our countries. I believe that overall our relationship with China today is positive and complementary. Our annual bilateral trade now exceeds $500 billion, and in June, Presidents Obama and Xi committed to a significant and concrete goal to reduce emissions that contribute to climate change. But as in any other relationship, there have been and will continue to be stresses and challenges. The economic imbalances between our countries pose legitimate questions about the health of our relationship, and recent tightening on the freedoms of journalists, lawyers, public advocates, and social media in China is very troubling. As a result, Americans continue to raise questions about China's growing influence, the imbalance in trade, controversy over currency exchange rates, and Beijing's unique and opaque political system. Whichever way our leaders choose to respond to these concerns, their policies should be based not on emotion but reason, not on myth but fact. There's ample opportunity to do this, as I believe we are at a crucial moment in the relationship, a moment leaders on both sides recognize that we have to seize. Both countries have recently completed their respective leadership transitions. President Obama, almost a year into his second term, has already redoubled his administration's efforts to enhance our presence in Asia. Diplomatically, economically, and militarily, we must continue to rebalance to Asia. For almost 70 years, our nation has paid in both blood and treasure to guarantee peace and stability in the region, and Asia has benefited from Washington's engagement. Our agenda is simple. We want to reassure our allies by providing security and stability in the region. We want to maintain a reliable and credible governing architecture. We want to bolster lasting institutions where nations can resolve their differences. And we want to advance economic relationships throughout the region through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. By opening up markets, we can unleash the incredible human potential in Asia so that living standards can continue to rise. Perhaps more than many of his predecessors, President Obama has shown a personal interest in Asia. Having spent part of his childhood there, he has referred to himself often as America's first Pacific president. This must continue. We need to send a strong message that the United States is as much a Pacific nation as it is an Atlantic nation. And China, too, has just completed a political transition, with President Xi now at the helm. He has shown a deep interest not only in building stronger ties with the United States, but also in our country itself. I had the opportunity to meet then Vice President Xi in February 2012 when the Chinese embassy hosted a small dinner in honor of his visit to the United States. That evening, he told us about his days in Iowa on an exchange program. He said he'd kept in touch with his hosts and fondly recalled the generosity he encountered, his love for Mark Twain, and the beauty of Muscatine at sunset. In our conversation, he appeared to be very much attuned to the needs of his domestic constituents and has since taken on populist themes to enhance his and the party's credibility with the Chinese people. The openness that Presidents Obama and Xi have displayed with one another and in their one-on-one interactions at the Sunnyland Summit in June show that our bilateral relationship is becoming not only more regularized, but also more personalized. I continue to travel to China frequently, and many of the other new senior leaders have been impressive. They often speak to me about the Chinese dream, a new aspiration coined by Xi himself, which supposedly aims to bring greater prosperity and comfort to a broader swath of China. I suspect that these leaders realize that for the Chinese dream to materialize, they have no choice but to work closely with the United States, for our two societies are increasingly bound together. This doesn't mean that we will always agree, and Americans will always speak out for our core values: freedom, market-based capitalism, democracy, and the advancement of a rules-based order where all nations can thrive. As chair of the National Democratic Institute, I often wrestle with these deeply profound issues. I've raised them with the Chinese during bilateral dialogues our two countries have co-hosted, including at one that brought representatives from the American Democratic and Republican parties together with their Chinese Communist Party counterparts to discuss political party development. We may have our disagreements, but dialogues such as these are important channels to make our views clear and to confront our differences. And I think that this kind of regular, frank interaction is what the two presidents had in mind when they spoke of the need to build a new model of bilateral relations at the Sunnyland Summit in June. Despite our differences, we must ask ourselves, can we work together to solve some of the thorniest bilateral and global issues of our time? Will we promote the development of international institutions and advance peace in trouble spots from Syria to the Korean Peninsula? Will we move forward with all nations to safeguard innovation and intellectual property by fighting cybercrimes and recent irritant in the relationship. Will China assume the responsibility of a global stakeholder, helping to keep the peace and upholding the rule of law around the world? Rhetorical questions are, of course, easy to ask but painful to answer, and it's always easier to recite goals than to achieve them. But if a new model of bilateral relations provides a framework for two fundamentally different nations to resolve these challenges, then perhaps it is a worthy goal for us to pursue together. So in that spirit, as we write the next chapter in our bilateral relationship, I want to close tonight by seeking some insight from the past. In many years of study and practice in diplomacy, I have learned that nothing is inevitable, not America's achievement of greatness, nor China's march toward it. The progress of history is delicate, and a nation's path through it must be constantly maintained, perfected, and reassessed. Over 40 years ago, an American president arrived in China and began a relationship that has moved the world in ways that few could have imagined. Since then, we've had 7 successive U.S. administrations, and all have endeavored to maintain stable relations with China, even as domestic partnership ebbed and flowed and events challenged the strength of our ties. Across the Pacific, 5 Chinese governments have done the same. We have seen crisis and tensions from Tiananmen to Taiwan, from commercial frictions to cyber aggressions. Yet we have managed them as best we could, because being honest about these issues while finding areas ripe for bilateral cooperation are equally important to American national interests. In this moment in time, our relationship must continue to mature. Washington does not want to carry all the world's burdens, and we want Beijing to assume a role in global leadership. This is something that we Americans should welcome for the benefit of our own citizens and those around the world. So with history as a source of insight, with maturity and vigilance as defining characters of actions, and with the hope of a stable and prosperous world as a guide, there's every reason to believe that we can advance this relationship for another 40 years and beyond. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Secretary Albright. I think that talk reminds us why you've been such an inspirational leader to so many women and men in the United States. I'm sure I could hear the applause in all the 66 venues. Let me use the moderator's prerogative and just ask one question tonight. This will be the only one I will ask, which is, you said Washington does not want to carry all the world's burdens, and we want Beijing to assume a role in global leadership. How can Beijing assume this role without usurping the Americans' role and creating tension in kind of the policy-making community in the United States?
Well, I have from the very beginning said that the United States is the indispensable nation. I said it at the United Nations, and I said it as secretary, but there is nothing in the word indispensable that says alone. And I believe the kinds of issues that are out there that have to be dealt with require partnership. So how to deal with terrorism without creating more terrorists, how to deal with nuclear proliferation, how to deal with the issues that are energy, environment, global pandemics, how to deal with the growing gap between the rich and the poor, require us to have partners. And I believe that the Chinese, if they look at those issues that I mentioned, also have an interest in dealing with them. And so I think in a spirit of partnership to try to keep the world, that we have a natural way of working together.
First question from Grand Rapids, Dixie. China has commented on the dysfunction of our government with respect to our budget process and debt ceiling debate. How do you think this might impact the economic relationship between the two countries?
I have to say, I recently had a discussion with a Chinese official, and he asked me, so what is going on in your country? And I explained that we have a two-party system, and we argue in the open. They have a one-party system, and they argue underneath that umbrella. And basically, I think that in many ways, arguments are useful. Compromise is more important. I do think that the Chinese are looking at us in terms of what is going on. However, the government is functioning. There are discussions going on our economic relationship, and ultimately, I think the Chinese do recognize also that we are the power that we are, and that we will get our act together.
From Twitter, Peter from the University of Pittsburgh. Obama's pivot to Asia and China's military rise are feeding mutual distrust. Is there a way out?
I think what's interesting on the rebalancing to Asia is it depends on who is talking about it. I think that there is a group in China and a group in the United States that does see kind of military threats from each other. And the Chinese believe that we are trying to contain them. And we believe, some of those that advocate this more robust view, that the Chinese are moving out and have aircraft carriers and submarines, and that they are a threat. I think that there's another part to this, which is that we do, as I mentioned in my remarks, have many issues in common that we should be trying to work together on. The problem is that if you only listen to those that are suspicious of the relationship, it kind of becomes a vicious circle.
Anne in Beijing, via Twitter, asks, at Sunnylands, we saw a new type of U.S.-China communication, no scripted talking points. That seems to me essential to building trust and cooperation. Can it continue?
One would hope so. I think one of the hard parts about any official meeting, officials are always handed talking points, and I will very much remember a real discussion that I had with the Chinese Foreign Minister, Chen Chi-chen, at the time, and I said, here are my talking points, give me your talking points, and let's have a strategic discussion. And I do think that the kind of discussion that the two presidents had, the No Necktie Summit, as it was known, I think did help to build a relationship between these two leaders, but ultimately we are going to have to work across the whole board of our government and theirs in order to build that relationship.
From Orion at the Middlebury College venue, what do you view as the most significant debate within the U.S. foreign policy community with respect to China policy, and what are your personal views with respect to that debate?
I think that the debate is one basically as to how much of our debt and our economy is dependent on Chinese activities. So I think to a great extent it's an economic discussion. We obviously want to have a balanced trading relationship with the Chinese, and we want to have jobs created. We like their market, we need their market. So I think mostly looking at it from both angles, in terms of those who favor more economic relationship with the Chinese, they see it positively, than those who fear the relationship that the Chinese are taking advantage of us. So that is the largest part of the relationship. And then there also are strategic issues in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, a real desire to have China have a global role. Will they take advantage of that global role because they're energy hungry and they need resources, and so is what they're doing abroad more a resource hunt than global partnership. So it's a complicated relationship. I think one of the things that one always says in diplomacy when there are many issues, that it's a multifaceted relationship. So we do have this multifaceted relationship with the Chinese.
This is Chris from Baltimore. It could be said that the U.S. and China are investing in emerging markets based on divergent models. How can our two nations work together in these areas? I think, meaning this is an AID model. Their Chinese aid model and our aid model are quite different.
Well, I think that that's true, and it's kind of what I alluded to in the previous answer. We are a generous country, and we do give assistance in a variety of ways. We often condition it in some way, that we want to see certain changes in having the rule of law or commercial codes or democracy, and the Chinese basically give grants. And I was in a country in Africa not long ago, and there were discussions about whether a road should be built through one of the wild areas where the animals are. And we had all kinds of environmental regulations, and the Chinese came and said, where do you want it? So there is a difference. And some of I think it does make some people nervous in terms of how quickly the Chinese go into a country and the aid issues, but also the kind of deals that they make. So my views here generally are that we need to have a really much more expanded relationship with the Chinese, but we don't have to accept everything that they do. And we have our role as we discuss what American national interests are.
This is Doug without a venue. Do you think the current crackdown on media, academics, and others in China will continue? And if so, should the U.S. confront China about these restrictions?
Well, let me say always, in this multifaceted relationship that I mentioned, there was not a time that I didn't meet with the Chinese that I didn't raise issues that had to do with human rights and religious freedom and various academic issues or whatever are very much our core values. One has to do this. I think that when you have a relationship and you're developing a friendship, you have to be frank. And we don't do any favors, certainly to our people or theirs, if we don't talk about these things. So I wouldn't ever pull any punches on these issues. I think that is the normal standard for American diplomats and leaders, and I think that we have to keep stating what we believe in, and the Chinese people are hearing it more and more. We have to be true to the core values that we profess and respond to their questions about what we're doing in a frank and honest way.
Mm-hmm. This is via Twitter from Clifton. The U.S. invited the Chinese Navy to participate in RIMPAC 2014, joint naval exercises in the Pacific that include many of China's neighbors. How will this impact U.S.-Japan relations?
Well, this is one of the more complex issues, and part of it does have to do with the fact that the Chinese Navy is expanding. They are developing a blue water navy, and we are recently reading about new submarines that they have. And we are concerned generally about some of the aspects of expansion of the Chinese in the South China Sea, East China Sea. But one of the issues that is out there is specifically the Sino-Japanese relationship and the conflicts that they're already having about certain islands. We have a treaty of alliance with the Japanese, and we will obviously continue to make that very clear, but it does not preclude us from having exercises with other countries. But I think it's very clear to people that there is a concern about what is going on between China and Japan, potentially nervous-making.
This is Jim from Madison, Wisconsin. With China holding such a large portion of our debt, is the U.S. at particular risk vis-a-vis diplomatic relations? By the way, I think China holds less than 10%. So the basis of that question may...
Well, clearly, I think that this is, on a previous question when you asked, what is the major subject of discussion, it is this economic issue and who is dependent upon whom. There is no question that we have a symbiotic relationship on the economic issues. The Chinese do hold a portion of our debt. They need us for their markets. And so it is very much not a subject that's apart from diplomacy. And that the talks that we have with the Chinese are on a strategic level, on an economic level, and a number of aspects that all go together in this multifaceted relationship.
From Patrick O'Connor in one of our Massachusetts venues, do you believe China's emerging involvement in Africa and the Mideast will harm U.S.-China relations in the coming decades?
I think that the question is whether we operate in a way where some of our approaches in other emerging markets or other areas are complementary or competitive. And again, I think it's very hard to have a generalization there. I think in some areas we have complementary aspects of trying to figure out what to do. And in others, we are competitors. And some of this has to do with the Chinese style just doing grants or deals, and really going into countries where they are searching for resources. So potentially, I think that there may be some really competitive aspects to it. And this is the real question as to how diplomatically you handle developing a relationship where we want to see them take some global responsibility, at the same time being somewhat nervous about some of the things they do.
How do you think about, as our energy independence approaches and our reliance on Mideast oil becomes virtually nil by 2020, how do you see the U.S.-China relationship playing out in Mideast in that context, where China is becoming heavily reliant on Mideast oil, the U.S. is becoming independent of Mideast oil, yet our Navy protects those sea lanes?
Well, I think there are obviously changes in the energy picture, but I personally have never believed that our only interest in the Middle East is over oil. We have a strategic interest in the Middle East. We will, I believe, have a presence of some kind there for the foreseeable future. I do think also in the oil story, the United States, even if we do become energy independent, are concerned about global oil prices. So it isn't as if we're just completely out of the oil story. And also, the Chinese may behave in a different way if they need the oil out of the Middle East in terms of helping promote stability. I think the bottom line is we don't quite know yet, but I do believe that we are not totally abandoning the Middle East in order to have either the Russians or the Chinese take it over.
Yeah. Does it, clearly, but does it require rebalancing of our kind of activities in the Mideast?
Well, you know what's interesting is I was asked a question after the, so somebody said to me, so what do you think about President Obama's rebalancing to Asia, and what are you going to do about West Asia? And I thought, what is West Asia? Well, West Asia is the Middle East. So we are not out of there completely, and I think that the United States is a country that does have global responsibilities, and we are not just going to abandon certain areas.
From Colby College, what's your opinion about the strict restriction towards Tibetans and foreigners going into Tibet and its effect on the issues between China and Tibet and other minority groups?
I have always been troubled about what has been going on between the Chinese and the Tibetans and what has happened in Tibet. I think this is one of the issues that is always raised in diplomatic conversations of all kinds, and the restrictions in terms of how the Tibetans are treated and then access to Tibet itself. So I think it is one of the more troubling aspects, and I also think we simply have to speak out when something akin to what is really isolating a very important area of the world, or where people's rights are not honored. We have to speak out about it, and I've never agreed with people who have thought that the U.S.-Chinese relationship is so important that you don't raise those issues. You have to raise those issues on a regular basis.
This is from Baton Rouge at LSU. Should we expect China to take on the role of peacekeeper in the future? If so, then will China operate under UN auspices or as its own peacekeeping entity? That's the question I would note. I believe China has over 2,000 peacekeepers operating under UN auspices presently.
What is interesting is that there was a time that peacekeeping operations before the end of the Cold War, that the permanent members of the Security Council usually did not take part in them. The peacekeeping operations have changed a lot. We did a lot in the 90s to kind of look at how they should be operating in a post-Cold War scenario. And the Chinese now do have, as you mentioned, over 1,000 peacekeepers, and they do operate within the UN mandates. So that is something that has changed. What was interesting when I was at the UN was that the Chinese did not really like to participate in a lot of international discussions. They mostly abstained on votes, and it was part of, were they really global partners in anything, because they really didn't participate. They now are, in fact, participating in peacekeeping, and from everything that I know, they do abide by the UN mandates. And they do contribute. They contribute actually more troops than we do at this point.
Yes. This is, again, don't know the venue. George, how should the United States react to China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, as well as potential energy independence from claims in the South China Sea?
Generally, I think that there is concern about what the Chinese activities are in the South China Sea and competition over certain islands with some of our allies. And the fact that they want to deal with these issues on a bilateral basis, whether it's with the Philippines or Vietnam or Japan, and we believe that there needs to be some kind of international structure that allows there to become kind of rules of the road for the area. In various meetings that I've participated in, this is very much a subject on people's minds, and one that is worrisome, not just in the Chinese-Japanese relationship, but with our other allies in the region. And I think people are concerned. They're also concerned about an accident that could happen, that some fishing vessels are there and there could be a ramming or something that happens, and that there's not a system of kind of hotlines or anything that would make sure that an accident might not escalate into something worse. So the bottom line is people are concerned about it. There's no question. And some of it has to do with resources, and some of it just has to do with territorial expansion. But I think of the various areas that concern people in our relationship with China, that one is right up there.
Mm-hmm. This is an interesting question from Roro in New Haven, Connecticut. With our growing economic stratification, can the United States learn from China's rapidly growing income gap, or will it be the other way around?
I can't see that we would learn on this. We obviously have very different systems, and I think that they have not dealt very well with their income gap. That's what I have found interesting. For a one-party state, they have gaps between the rich and the poor, also between urban and rural, and so I think we have more to teach them, but they aren't really looking at our system for teaching. But I do not think that we could learn much from a one-party state.
Let's see, SAR at the University of Pittsburgh. University of Pittsburgh has asked the most questions today. What programs, if any, is China developing to address the issue of air pollution, especially in Beijing? Before this program started, you in fact mentioned visiting Beijing when the air was dense with pollution and fog.
Well, I think unless you've been there, it's much worse than even looking at pictures in our newspapers or on TV. You can't see out the window of your hotel, and it looks like it's dark in the middle of the day. They have tried various things. They managed to deal with things during the Olympics in terms of having alternate driving days and a variety of different things. I do think that there has been a step forward in terms of the agreement that President Obama and President Xi reached on some rules on emissions. And the question is to what extent the Chinese will live up to what they're doing and move away from coal. But they know what their problems are. I mean, and my own sense from being there is that people, they cannot go into, they are the world's second largest economy, but how they can't do it in this particular way. There's no question. And they have to figure out a way to deal with it. Fewer cars or emissions, but they know they've got a problem.
Yeah, it was interesting to see that the Chinese government today announced that they're going to be studying the link between this pollution and health issues.
Yeah.
It's
a tough admission to make, I have to say, though. When you can't breathe or see, ultimately you have to do something.
Judy in Iowa, could you comment on U.S. concerns over Chinese cyber spying and Chinese concerns over U.S. monitoring of everything and everyone?
Well, obviously this is the issue of the day. We have been concerned about what the Chinese have been doing in the cyber area, and primarily I'm going to say something again. Countries do spy on each other. You know, I think that it is what has happened for hundreds of years. But there are different kinds of, when you're looking at national security issues, kind of what does one country have in its military, et cetera. Those are the kinds of things that have gone on. What is troubling now is what people kind of call economic, the spying, of stealing intellectual property, of basically espionage economically, especially because the Chinese have state-owned enterprises, and so it's kind of how they operate, who gets the benefits from it. The Chinese, I think we need to establish some whole new way of trying to figure out how we deal in this cyber age, because we don't have any rules of the road. And I think as the issues have come out in the United States and other places, there needs to be a discussion of this and establishing some rules. But basically, what we have objected to is the cyber espionage in the industrial area.
Right. George, again, it doesn't say the venue. How do you feel that China will balance expenditures on military growth with expenditure on looming healthcare costs associated with an aging population?
I think that one of the things I have to say whenever I go to China and you think about the size of the country and their problems and how they deal with the discrepancies and the divisions within their own society, and that they don't like to admit that they're going on, I think that they do have to figure out that they have an aging population, mostly supported by one child as a result of the One China policy, and at the same time have to do with issues in terms of, do they want to expand their military, how much, and they, as any country, are trying to figure out the balance. They have a hard time. This is a huge population that, as many problems as the United States has at this moment, they are not anywhere near the kinds of issues that the Chinese have to deal with, and I think we are more honest in terms of admitting where our problems are. So that is something that they have to sort out.
This is from Frank, who's at the DePaul University venue in Chicago. How will China's investments in Latin America, a lot closer to home than Africa and the Mideast, affect its relationship with the United States?
Well, again, I think we are watching very carefully. I think that I remember when I was in office, I went down to the Panama Canal, and watching Chinese ships there was something that made people nervous. And then there are other places where we feel that this is the Western Hemisphere. But I think we have to get used to the fact that the Chinese, we can't have it both ways. If we want them to be partners or play a global role of responsibility, they're going to be global. And the best thing about the United States is we are innovative, we have a democracy, we know how to respect other countries, and so I am not afraid of the competition, but we have to get our act back together and also give a real leg up to those who have innovative ideas.
We've talked about now Latin America, Asia, the Mideast, and Africa. How about investment in the United States? What do you think the implications of that are for the relationship?
Well, I think actually we should welcome investments in the United States, depending upon in what area it is. But I think that there are certain places where we want to see Chinese investment that create jobs, that help us in a number of ways. So it depends on the investment, but I really do think that for the most part, people want to see Chinese investment in the United States.
Yeah. From Andrew, asked this via Twitter, do you think that Nixon and Kissinger's realpolitik approach to China is the most effective one?
Well, it's interesting. It certainly worked. And as I met, Nixon and Kissinger did open China up. I have finally gotten my way through Kissinger's book on China, and it's fascinating in terms of the way that all was laid out and worked. I think that we have other, as I mentioned in my remarks, other presidents of the United States have followed up on a relationship with China. I think we do have to do it with eyes open, but the bottom line is we cannot forget about our value system. And I really do think it's essential when Americans go to China that we can't some apologize for various parts. I mean, I believe in democracy, and I also think that ultimately the Chinese would be more stable if they allowed more openness and had the capability of listening to some of their smart people in terms of ideas they have about the evolution of Chinese politics.
This earpiece is telling me we have 20 seconds left, but I want to thank you for what I could only describe as a tour de force in the U.S.-China relationship in these descriptions. As promised, I've heard Secretary Albright do this before, and she has done it spectacularly tonight. So thank you so much for being with us. And to all of our venues, enjoy the speakers that you have. Learn as much as you can about China, and if you want to visit us, you can visit us at ncuscr.org. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for the honor. I enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Before going into my prepared remarks, which I'll revise a little bit in light of what Secretary Albright said, I did want to respond to one of her first comments. She said that the big question in U.S.-China relations is whether we can work together to solve problems. I think this is one of two questions. I think there's another big question, which is maybe prior to the question of collaboration, and that is the question of whether we can avoid conflict. Whether we can avoid conflict. Why might we come into conflict? Several times they alluded to Chinese policies in the South China and the East China Sea. So if we, and this is what I think most people in Washington and in Hawaii worry about when they are looking at scenarios that could bring the United States and China into conflict, even though neither side would want that to happen. China has a different view. China has, since 1947, prior to the formation of the People's Republic of China, drawn what is called the 9-dash line, in which they say that China's territorial waters come all the way down here in a big old bag, and that the South China Sea is basically their lake. And they have not made clear claims as to what this is based on, but this area is claimed in whole or in part also by Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, Brunei. Secretary Albright just mentioned a guy named Li Jiaoxing, who had been at the United Nations and was then the Chinese ambassador to the United States, and then the Chinese foreign minister. Just this week, he was on a ship, and he actually took a swim on the James Shoal and said, this is China's essentially sacred territory. The James Shoal is right down here. And so China has territorial disputes with the Philippines. There are places well within the 200-mile exclusive economic zone of the Philippines that China claims. And some of these are America's allies. So this is the problem, is that China says this is one of our core interests. China has started calling this a core interest, and that's a phrase they also apply to Taiwan and Tibet. Core interests means something that's worth going to war to defend. And the United States says, no, it ain't either. So how is this going to work? One of the key questions is China and America have very different definitions of what constitutes stability in the Western Pacific. What China wants here, the best description that I've heard of it, is that they are after a zone of deference in the Western Pacific. America, Secretary Clinton, and Kerry subsequently, has described America's core interest in maintaining freedom of the seas and freedom of navigation in this same area. So something's got to give. So I think there are two key questions. Can we avoid conflict? And then that's sort of the more negative question. And then there's this positive question. Can we work together to solve some of the world's biggest challenges? Now, the Chinese also see this as a core question, although they see it obviously from the other side. You heard Madeline Albright refer several times to this new great power relationship, which was actually something that was raised by the Chinese side, by Xi Jinping. and that Washington has been repeating. And what this means, when you hear this phrase, new great power relationship, neither China nor America knows what the specific content of this is going to be. We do agree on a negative definition. We agree that it expresses our joint wish not to go to war. And this is obviously a very good foundation. It's a good starting point. There's a joint wish to avoid what has come to be called the Thucydides trap. And the Thucydides trap refers to studies that have been done of the last 15 times that you've had a rising power and an established power. What is the nature of that dynamic? And the answer is that 10 out of the 15 times they've gone to war. So we want to avoid the Thucydides trap with a new kind of great power relationship. Both sides want that. Neither side wants war. How do we get there if our core interests would appear to be in direct conflict in this very vital part of the world? That's a big question that I thought the Secretary perhaps glossed over a little bit. Okay, maybe I don't want two mics near each other, right? Am I going to get horrible feedback? Okay. That's okay. I'll put this here. I hope the system doesn't screech at you. So very quickly, I had wanted to talk about two themes in contemporary China, Reformation and Renaissance. Something very strange when we look at China, there's a great deal of talk about reform, and at the same time, we have very ambitious, optimistic, confident, triumphalist statements about a rejuvenation or renaissance of the Chinese culture. And there would seem to be a disjunct between dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs, constant calls for reform, and a sort of a triumphalist sense that China's moment has come to reemerge on the world stage. So I wanted to try to get at that, what may or may not be a disjunct. I think that understanding that is key to understanding the People's Republic of China today. And I emphasize today. One of the things that characterizes China is very, very rapid change. And so if we met again in 2 or 3 months, we might have a very different discussion than we would have this evening. So China is, I say, lots of talk of reform, and you're going to be hearing about this especially in November when there's a big national meeting where the leaders of China will put forth a blueprint for China's reforms over the next 10 years. And it's interesting as a question of cultural style that with all of the difficulties that the United States has faced since 2008, we don't hear calls for reform. Somehow that word, that approach doesn't seem to be in our DNA, whereas the Chinese are very comfortable talking about reform. In fact, from the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 until the beginning of the reform period begins when Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 1978, you had 29 years of non-reform. Since then, you've had 35 years of reform. Reform has become sort of the norm in China. It's an odd way of speaking, but obviously it speaks to a great deal of dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs in China. So what are the main problems that China faces from the Chinese point of view? And I want to emphasize that what China thinks it needs to reform rather than things that America thinks China needs to reform. Secretary Albright alluded to this rich-poor disparity, which is enormous. In many Chinese cities, there are people of fantastic wealth and who live at a technological and material level, probably higher up on the food chain than most of us do. And then in the vast interior of China, you have people who are living at the same time in a virtually medieval set of circumstances. So the rich-poor disparity is a big source of anxiety for China. Corruption. Across the country, from Beijing down to the localities, not only in government, but in corporations, in schools and in education, in access to public health, corruption is an enormous problem. And China recognizes this. They don't need me to tell them this. Education, badly in need of reform. Chinese themselves are very dissatisfied with what they call the Gaokao system, or 应试教育. Gaokao is the national system, one test to get into college. And it's your more or less one shot. And because you get one shot, everything is driven toward this one very difficult test. And you then have a testing-based system of public education, which I would argue we're evolving now very much to our detriment in the United States and for similar reasons. So you've got students who are growing up working very, very hard, burning themselves out, not because of love of learning, but based on family pressure, teacher pressure, and fear. fear of failure. And this has been exacerbated when you have families with only one child. And the Chinese themselves are deeply aware of the costs of this to individuals, and people are calling for reform. Medicine, we've mentioned. China has enormous demographic problems. The first is the graying of the Chinese population. It's often said that China will be the first country to get old before it gets rich. You're going to have an enormous number of retired people supported by the one child per family generation, and China does not have an answer to this. One of China's other demographic problems is that you are in a few short years going to have as many as 30 million young Chinese males who cannot find wives. This is also a result of the one-child policy. Because of that policy, combined with the Chinese traditional preference for boys, combined with ready access to ultrasound, you've had a lot of sex-selective abortion in China. 30 million young men who can't find women, and historically in China and other countries, when this happened, men revolt for obvious reasons. So demographics, pollution, also alluded to today, an enormous source of dissatisfaction. China's own statistics say that if you grow up in the north of China, on average it takes 5 years off of your life, growing up breathing the poisoned air in the north of China, and it's spreading south as well. China also has a big problem with pollution of its water and land resources. Those are the things that China is dissatisfied with domestically and why they want reform. It also has international dissatisfactions with China's relative economic and political status. China is very aware of its relative poverty, although China gets wealthier and wealthier, and if you go to Shanghai and Beijing, you say, where's the poverty? You have to also look at China nationally. One of the ways that I've heard this described is other countries look at China and they multiply everything China has times 1.4 billion people, and they get worried. China takes its limited resources and divides by 1.4 billion and is very concerned about their ability to catch up. So China's worried about its poverty internationally. China is very concerned that it is not an innovative society. For all of its very, very hard work and for all of its economic improvements, China has not been a source of new ideas, new technologies, great works of art. The country which, throughout human history, unquestionably has the greatest tradition of invention, and which has tremendous aesthetic accomplishments as well in poetry and painting, and garden development, calligraphy, is not a leading source of new ideas and technology, doesn't have much cultural attraction. China is very aware that in international spheres it is a rule taker, not a rule maker, and that it also doesn't have what it calls discursive power, the power to affect international discourse. So China's frustrated by this. But it senses at the same time that its time has come. China's time has come. And the subtext for this entire Chinatown Hall, and I think all of these discussions, is what we call China's rise, the rise of China. And I've watched with great interest as this phrase has gained currency beginning in the late 90s and through the early parts of this century until my sense is about 2005. The rise of China was followed by a question mark, implicit. Is China rising? Is this really going to happen? Is this real? And then beginning about 2005, but certainly by 2008, we changed the punctuation and started using an exclamation point. Punctuation means everything. China is rising. China is coming. How do we respond? So China is rising. We talked about the Thucydides trap. China is the rising power. America is the establishment power. China's rise is unlike previous rises, however, in that China is the first country to rise, and it's risen on a scale and at a pace that are unprecedented in human history. It is the first country to rise where there is no space. They are the first to rise in a globalized world, so that when we had the European rise, they were able to take colonies. America had the vast American mainland, and we manifest destiny, and we would have wars and defeat our enemies until we got to the West Coast. We had space to rise. So China rises, and there are spaces on every piece on the chessboard. It has the same impulses that other rising nations, certainly including we have, but where do you go? Not only is there no geographic space for China, there's no normative space. The rules of the game have been set. There's no space to change the discourse. even the forms in which China must compete politically through the UN and multilateral organizations, economically through Bretton Woods and the other post-World War II organizations, culturally in terms of soft power, films, novels, these are not Chinese forms. All of the rules of the game have all been preset, and so China has risen more rapidly and on a greater scale than any previous rising power, but is more constrained. So from this point of view, regardless of what we think of the Communist Party or China, I think we should have some understanding for China's position. This is unprecedented. And this is one of the reasons that even as China talks about reform, the leaders also talk about renaissance, rejuvenation of China. And Xi Jinping has talked about this a lot from the time that he came into office. Madeline Albright just said that he has been sounding populist themes. That's very true. He's also been sounding nationalist themes. Now, nationalism, this is a tricky word. Mine is patriotism, yours is nationalism, right? Mine is just justified love of country, whereas yours is, bellicose nationalism. So we need to be reflective. This is about national reflections. But he has sounded populist nationalist themes, talked about the China dream, and what this really means to China, in my view, is that China has a very, very deep and justified sense of itself as the country which through most of human history has been the most accomplished country on earth. Economically, culturally, technologically, by almost any measure, the Chinese know their education system reinforces the great accomplishments of traditional China, and they're in the main correct about this. They are correct about that. And following China's greatness, you have what the Chinese call the century of humiliation, beginning in about 1840 with the Opium War. So you have greatness debunked. And if you just want to get a little sense of this, think about the United States now. Suppose that almost overnight, in the course of a week, you wake up and you find that the United States has been conquered in a single battle off the Florida Keys by Madagascar. And not only have we been conquered, but it's obvious that they have better technology than we do. We have stronger institutions than we do. This is unthinkable. This is the stuff of science fiction. Think about the ego wound that would produce to the United States. I think that even those of us who are internationally minded and who see ourselves as liberally minded, if we're honest, confidence in American preeminence is really very, very important to us. And in some cases, foundational even to our sense of who we are as individuals. Think about when that's debunked. Think about 9/11, just the ego wound that caused to the United States. China's been through something much greater than that. And now they sense that their time is coming back. And this is why Xi Jinping wants to celebrate renaissance and rejuvenation, even as he tries to tackle reform at the same time. What does China want when it looks at this map and other maps? In my view, this is a subjective view, please challenge it. The main China claim as it approaches Asia-Pacific is that a Sino-centric Asia, an Asia-Pacific where China is big dog, top dog, Dagua, the big country. A Sino-centric Asia is natural, inevitable, and desirable. And when China views it as natural, it means that China cannot be blamed for seeking dominance or hegemony in Asia. It's inevitable means resistance is futile, right? You'd best accord yourself with it. But China also believes that its dominance in East Asia is desirable, that it should be self-evident that China would be a benevolent great power. China is a great believer in its own benevolence, and its rhetoric and its actions would seem to imply that it thinks its benevolence should be obvious. Now, this may seem very odd to Americans because we're used to different narratives about China, and we receive several different kinds of signals from China. We recognize and in large part admire the tremendous achievements of the Chinese people over the past 30 years. But we also have narratives about Chinese ideology, lack of respect for human rights, lack of freedom of the press. Liu Xiaobo, the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, is in prison. Since Xi Jinping came into power, he's imprisoned more dissidents. He has limited academic freedom and freedom of the press. So we have these mixed narratives about China, all of which are in whole or in part true, but they don't imply that China would be a benevolent power. It's hard for us to accept this. It's important to understand in looking at China and in listening to the rhetoric of the leaders that just as Americans have very important virtue narratives about ourselves, China also has a virtue narrative. It believes in itself as the great country of virtue, and we tell ourselves the same stories when we talk about the rest of the world wanting American leadership, that we can have nuclear arsenals that could destroy the world many times over, but other countries can't have any nuclear arsenals at all. Why? Because we are the good, right? Our power comes from our goodness, and so everybody else should be comfortable with this. China tells itself the same story. John Adams said, "Power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak, and that it is doing God's service when it is violating all of his laws." And China has an equally powerful, equally deeply entrenched virtue narrative, backed up by a much, much longer history, far more cultural coherence, and real great achievements. And China, I think we need to recognize when the Chinese talk about the Renaissance, my own view is that not only that China has achieved much in the past, but China, if it were free, has a tremendous amount to offer. Tremendous amount to offer. My own involvement with China for the past 30 years has enriched every aspect of my life. It's a debt that I cannot hope to repay. And I think that we would learn a lot. You know, China is 1/5 of the world's population. It has 1/5 of the world's talent if it were released. In fact, I would put money down. China has more than 1/5 of the world's talent, because one of the virtue narratives they tell themselves, which is true, is that they really do work very hard, suffer much, and highly value education. So I think that with freedom, China really would produce a renaissance of sorts. So how to reconcile this reform, sense that China is not doing so well, with the calls for renaissance, in the sense that renaissance is right there, that the moment of China's greatness has arrived. These calls for reform, I think, indicate some of the best aspects of Chinese political culture. They contain a great deal of humility. China has shown a remarkable amount of flexibility and adaptability. It's one of the great strengths of China. The Chinese tell themselves that they love stability and hate chaos. It's not true. They've endured more chaos in the past 30 years and have handled it extremely well. America is actually much more stable. So China has faced a tremendous, unprecedented number of challenges in the past 30 years, and the Chinese have proved themselves tremendously adaptable. Another one of China's great strengths, I think, and as usual strengths, there's a flip side that's a weakness, but there's a great sense of common cause in China. Most Chinese, very few exceptions, would agree about what the national project is. Raise the standards of living, make China a more powerful nation. Very broad buy-in. People would quibble with details. China's a very diverse place. There are dissident communities in China, but by and large, the Chinese people buy into this national project and are willing to work for and sacrifice for it. And it's a forward-looking project. Since the end of the Cold War, what is our common cause, other than holding on to what we've already got, which is a more passive and a less active kind of mission? It's not as inspiring. This is the advantage of being the rising power and not the status quo power. So China has a lot of strengths, a lot to offer. So it's reform for the sake of hastening the day of the arrival of this renaissance. And China is able to pursue both at once, to be self-critical to a degree about what China needs to change, while also declaring that China's day has arrived, one, because China has a huge amount of very deep civilizational confidence based on its long history and its past accomplishments. And also its political authoritarianism helps it too, to sort of have this two-track agenda, which is reform based on a really hard look at our deficiencies while celebrating the coming of Chinese glory at the same time. So very quickly, how do we deal with China? Well, first and foremost, I think Secretary Albright was correct. We have to get our own house in order. You know, America needs to solve many of its own domestic problems, and that's a domestic discussion that should be beyond the scope of the National Chinatown Hall. But if America wants to continue to be regarded as the international leader and wants to continue to be one of the formers of norms, we have to make sure that we are a country that's deserving of continued admiration and emulation. We need to take a long view, which is something we're not very good at. The Chinese are much better at this because their leaders, national leaders, serve 10-year terms. And of course, they don't do polling, they don't have a free press or an independent judiciary or opposition parties, or this also helps you to have a nice, stable 10-year term. But there are advantages to that. I think that in thinking about U.S.-China relations, too, we have to take a multilateral view, and the World Affairs Councils are very good at doing this. Too many discussions of the U.S. and China act as if these are the only two countries on Earth. And when you talk that way, when you look at the problems in the Western Pacific, it's hard not to conclude that we're bound for conflict. But when you take the rest of the world into consideration as a moderating influence, multilateralism is probably what saves the United States and China from itself, as is the growing body of talent. Most of it has come from China to the United States, studied here, gone back to China, but the growing number of Americans who also go to China. My own personal view is that one of the best things we could do to guarantee stable U.S.-China relations in the long term is to begin study of all foreign languages, not in middle school or high school, but in the first grade, and Chinese should be second only to Spanish in the United States. I feel very strongly about. So I think that one of the things that Secretary Albright said well is that we need to defend our truly core national interests and not compromise our values. I think she made that case very clearly. But we also have to find ways to give China a say in remaking the rules. When 1/5 of the world's population suddenly comes onto the football field, the rules have got to change. The whole nature of the game has changed. We do have to work with China to work on international pandemics, international consumer product safety and food safety issues. We have to work with China. Transboundary pollution, new trading regimes, cyber questions, the questions of the exploration, exploitation, and weaponization of space. How will nanotechnologies be used? How will our ability to map the human genome be used? The new frontiers, the space, are technological frontiers. We have to work with China. Say the Western Pacific is the most acute problem. And to do that through dialogue, America has to get a little bit better at listening. We tend to want to wag a finger at China and tell China what it should do. They've heard that. They don't like it much, but they've heard it. We need to become a little bit more adept at listening on our side. China, on its side, has to become better at talking. China has long complained that the existing world order was set up by the Western countries, primarily by the United States after World War II, to serve our own interests. And they don't like the old world order. Now, Chinese rhetoric has changed. They started to admit what is true, which is that China has been one of the greatest beneficiaries of the world order. Nevertheless, they say they want to change the world order to make it more just and more rational. I think we need to give that a really serious hearing. China has not been willing to say what they want. They say they want changes, but they haven't been willing to float any proposals. We have to find new ways of dialogue that will let them do that. And then in closing, I think that if we're going to have constructive dialogues, each side has to give a little something conceptually. I think that America, despite our legitimate concerns about human rights in China and the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, I think we need to recognize that China's rise in the main is legitimate. It represents human striving. And one of the first things we need to say in any dialogue to the Chinese is, congratulations, this is incredible. China's rise is legitimate. I think China needs to recognize that even though its rise is legitimate, other countries' concerns about its rise are also legitimate because real interests are being infringed upon. If we can grant that, then we can perhaps have a very constructive dialogue. We have a hard time doing this. China very frequently accuses the United States of being arrogant. This is their great accusation against the United States, is you are arrogant. And it's a fair cop, right? I mean, for the most part, this is true. Now, China is also extraordinarily arrogant. We've got dueling arrogances. And the styles of arrogance, the causes of arrogance are very different. But we spend a lot of time arguing about who's arrogant, which reminds me of, and this will be the final word, but I think should be a guide for all of our diplomatic relations, which of course comes from Mr. Ogden Nash. And one of his greatest poems, think of Dueling Arrogance, goes like this, is, he drinks because she nags, he thinks. She says she nags because he drinks. And neither will admit what's true, that he's a sot and she's a shrew. So we both need to take a look at ourselves and then have a conversation with each other. So thank you very much. So I'm sorry, Tim, I went over my time a little bit, but any questions, comments, anything at all? Yes, sir.
Sure. You said that China thinks that that a strong, self-assured China will be a good thing for Asia. But do they see any irony about how 70, 80 years ago that the Japanese-Asia co-prosperity sphere didn't work out very well for them at that time?
No. Not in relation to Japan. I think it's a fair question. In fact, China's current calls for a wealthy and prosperous country, Fuqiang Guojia, is almost identical to the main rallying call of the Japanese militarists who proposed a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. No, as far as I can tell, it's an irony-free zone in relation to this particular question, in part because China is so acutely aware of what Japan did to all of Asia. And they are, I lived in Nanjing for 6 years, which of course was where the rape of Nanking happened in 1937. And so, China harkens back to that on a daily basis. And I think there's an implicit claim that their understanding of what Japan did inoculates them from doing likewise, would be the implicit cultural claim. And again, I think what this phrase that what China wants is a zone of deference. China, I don't see the People's Liberation Army marching into other countries and invading other countries. A zone of deference means what they would like is anytime any country takes a major action in the East Asia Pacific area, that China's interests are considered first in relation to those actions. A zone of deference. But not, the People's Liberation Army does not have plans for land invasions in East Asia. That's not the threat. Yes, Commissioner?
For every reaction, there is an equal and opposite reaction. We've now seen Japan. Thank you. We've now seen Japan, Vietnam, the Philippines starting to build up their military. We've become increasingly active militarily in the area. The response doesn't seem to be triggering any favorable reaction from China,
Right.
particularly regarding the South China Sea concept and their desire to get at the oceanic resources. You didn't mention that in your list, but that's
Right.
probably on the list as well.
Right, and it's also Singapore, which is we have a new base agreement with for regular stops near Darwin, Northern Australia, a small permanent marine base. Malaysia is building up a new naval base in consultation with the U.S. Marine Corps. And China is interested not only in the South China Sea, but in turning the corner past the Straits and through the Straits of Malacca into the Indian Ocean with what it calls a string of pearls naval supply bases strategy. Now, it should be said that China has legitimate interests in the Indian Ocean. It has interest in keeping sea lanes open. It has interest in fighting piracy off the African coast. And this is where I say we have to recognize that China, what do they want? Well, they want, in no small part, what we have, what we enjoy. They've studied American power. They admire and envy American power. And they see it as being based not, as we would have it, on our virtue, but on our blue water navy and on our ability to project force across the world and on economic power. And so by what legitimate argument can we say that we can have it and you can't? There's also a very real question about how much force projection we can continue to afford in the region. This is very expensive. Can we really afford what we've claimed we want to do with the rebalance? So China would, to get back to your argument, China would disagree about what is stimulus and what is response in the scenario that you just laid out. And again, because there is no questioning of the fact that China's desire to be able to control its own destiny within what they call the first island chain. There's no questioning of the legitimacy of that. So the first island chain, the first island chain runs from the Ryukyu Islands, obviously includes all of Taiwan, and comes down and contains the 9-dash line. But there's also a second island chain which comes down through the Marianas and the smaller islands out here that China sees as sort of the secondary zone in which it wants to have relative freedom of movement. And it is true that geography somewhat bottles China in. It's hard to get out through the Straits of Malacca, to get out and have the kinds of freedom that they want. And so their desires in this regard are they don't question the legitimacy of that. And so what is stimulus and what is response? And we see this in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Who upset the status quo? China claims that the nationalization, the purchase of these islands upset the status quo. Nobody else seems to buy this line of argument. So there's disagreements about facts, stimulus and response. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
I have a question. Thank you. When we traveled in China about 4 or 5 years ago, we learned that there are big changes, of course, going on where people in the rural areas are all moving in very large numbers to urban areas.
Right.
In fact, it's considered to be the largest migration in human history,
Right.
we learned. How do you figure that that is affecting China's behavior at this point in terms of resource allocation, looking for resources?
Right.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not leading you because I really don't know.
No. Please go on.
Okay, that's all.
Well, it's a good, and China announced just in the past year new urbanization plans to move a number of people, additional to the people who've already moved, as you say correctly, this greatest migration, more people, roughly equivalent to the population of the United States, into cities. And this tends to result in greater intensity of resource uses, greater pollution. It's not clear that they have the jobs to absorb these people. So I would say that this question and probably the question of water scarcity in China are the two biggest to watch. They're obviously closely related, and one of the ways that they're already directly related, northern China, where Beijing, obviously the capital, Beijing and Tianjin are becoming a megacity, are located, was water scarce to begin with. And now you've got encroaching desertification on Beijing. And their answer to that to date is yet another mega project, what they call the South Waters North Project, to bring waters of the Yangtze through 5 channels north to the Yellow River Basin for use in industry, agriculture, and residential use. I think that 2 of those channels are completed. They are building the others now to bring South Waters north. There have long been suggestions that what they really need to do is move the capital south. That's not going to happen. And so this is, you say, water scarcity in particular, but also food scarcity is a big question. As these cities expand into the exurbs, and many of them are now moving out 10, 50, 100 miles from the original city core. And the city cores, these are ancient cities, and they were located where they were because it was the most fertile land in China where you could have sustainable agriculture and build up the surpluses on which civilization is based. So all of this urbanization amounts directly into the loss of some of the best agricultural land in China, as China's demand for agricultural land continues to skyrocket because they're eating more meat protein and therefore need more feed grain. And this is why they're seeking agricultural land in the Ukraine and other places. They're looking for, you hear a lot about extractive industries, timber and oil, but increasingly they're trying to lock down farmland as well. So these are the issues you want to follow, and this directly has a direct impact on you. In times of drought, I've been in China when this has happened. Drought in China, you get rain in the Central Plain, the price of grain futures drops on the Chicago commodities market because China is going to have to import less grain. So the weather in China directly impacts how much you are going to pay for Wonder Bread. And so I think that the story that our media hasn't covered yet, they write about China as though the threat to America comes from Chinese militarization. I don't think that's true. I think the challenge from China comes from the purchasing power of the Chinese people and the impact that has on world commodity prices. That's the big challenge, and it's a challenge for us too. Remember, if the rest of the world had the same material existence as the American middle class, you would need between 5 and 10 Earths worth of natural resources to meet that demand. And with a rising China, India, Brazil, something's got to give.
Hello.
How about at the...
Hi. It's a great honor to have a chance to talk with you, and my English name is Asia. I moved here around 2 years ago. Although everyone is so nice, the environment is very good, there are still a lot of cultural conflicts that I still need to be used to. So for example, at work, I have some working conflicts, and I'm very passionate, and I have a lot of energy. And they just think, oh, this little Chinese girl, you just keep doing what you are doing, and don't ask too much work. But I want to do more work, and I just don't know about American companies.
It sounds like you need to found your own.
So how should I be more, how could I behave, or what should I say,
I'm not going to tell you how to behave, but truly, think entrepreneurially.
Because I mentioned many times, I finished my work a little bit of technical work. My bachelor degree is computer science, but my biggest interest is communication and dealing with the cultural conflicts between China and the US.
Right.
But the thing is, I haven't had a chance. And my company is a global company. We are making bigger equipment for testing vehicles' safety, like alignment. And we have customers in China, but they haven't used me. The thing is.
There's energy, but it also has to be directed toward ideas. I'd say that it's incumbent on you. I say think entrepreneurially and come up with a very concrete business plan that shows benefit for the bottom line of your company and something that's implementable. So don't just ask them to look for your energy. They should look to your ideas.
Okay, so are there a lot of companies in Grand Rapids? Okay, thank you.
One more question? Sorry, one more? Yes, sir.
One more question.
This gentleman. I have one more question from this gentleman, if we could, because we're running out of time.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Just because you mentioned commodities, my understanding is that China is kind of against using genetically modified seeds, and it's been such a big boom to the U.S. to increase yields by using genetically modified seeds. What is kind of their apprehension and reservations if it might solve some of their
I think it's in many ways it's similar to Europe's. It's just sort of fears about frankenfoods generally. And in China, of course, China's extremely proud of its food culture and what they call 食文化. And there's never been a sharp line in China between food and medicine. These are different emphases on the same question of intake and what comes into your body. And there's very strong sense in China that American medicines are too strong and have bad side effects, and that we culturally don't think enough about what we ingest. And I think that it's going to be a learning process, and that I think that once China is able to produce its own genetically modified crops and the profits can go into Chinese corporate hands, you'll see a relatively quick change in points of view. I think it's both, questions. It's both sort of a technophobia, which a lot of Americans would also share. A lot of Americans are uncomfortable with this. It comes from their food culture, and it also because this is foreign. Not only is it strange, but it's doubly strange because it's foreign. I suspect that it will change because it's going to have to change. China's need to, feed its population is too acute.
That's about it. We have to wrap up. I want to. you. Thank you.